a massive corporate office tower, remain awake long after the city outside had begun to sleep. Its endless rows of fluorescent lights glowing coldly behind glass walls high above rain-covered streets, while inside the building keyboards continued clicking. Elevator doors opened and closed without emotion. Coffee machines hummed endlessly in empty corridors. And exhausted employees stared into glowing screens with the quiet intensity of people slowly sacrificing parts of themselves in exchange for stability, recognition, and the fragile promise that all the pressure would eventually mean something. And despite the appearance of professionalism, something heavier moved beneath the surface of the office. Something invisible but deeply understood by everyone inside it, because modern workplaces rarely demand only productivity. They demand identity. And identity, once tied completely to performance, slowly begins to consume the person performing it. And on that evening, managers, analysts, assistants, executives, interns, and overworked employees move between glass meeting rooms carrying laptops, deadlines, ambition, resentment, and carefully controlled exhaustion, each pretending to handle more pressure than they actually could, because an environment's built around competition. Vulnerability quickly becomes dangerous. At the far end of the office floor, untouched by the frantic rhythm surrounding him, stood Friedrich Nietzsche, calm, observant, watching the office not as a place of success, but as a machine quietly feeding on human energy while rewarding the appearance of resilience. And that difference did not go unnoticed, because people become aware of stillness most clearly when they themselves are overwhelmed. And one of the younger employees nearby, still wearing his company badge, dark circles beneath his eyes reflecting weeks of unfinished sleep, finally approached Nietzsche with the exhausted confidence of someone trying desperately to convince himself that burnout is proof of importance. And he asked a question that sounded professional on the surface, but carried something far heavier beneath it, asking whether sacrifice, overwork, and constant pressure are simply the price ambitious people must pay in order to matter, and whether modern work culture is truly helping people grow, or merely teaching them how to survive exhaustion more efficiently. And the question moved quietly through the office like static through fluorescent light, because everyone who overheard it recognized something personal within it. And burnout, unlike philosophy, rarely feels abstract, and Nietzsche did not answer immediately, and that silence created something unusual, because in places built around endless activity, silence feels heavier than noise, and heavy silence forces attention. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost softer than the hum of computers and distant printers echoing through the office. And he said that the modern worker is often praised not for living well, but for enduring self-destruction quietly. And the words did not land like motivation. They landed like recognition. And recognition, when aimed at hidden exhaustion, is never easily ignored. And the office, once filled with urgency and professionalism, no longer felt entirely productive. The keyboards did not stop clicking. The fluorescent lights still burned coldly above endless rows of desks and glowing monitors. The elevator still opened and closed as employees moved through glass corridors carrying deadlines, coffee cups, presentations, and carefully controlled stress. And yet, somehow, everything had already begun to feel different. Because once a thought begins to move inward, the world outside often becomes quieter, not because it changes, but because attention moves somewhere deeper, somewhere less comfortable, and the employees scattered across that sleepless office floor felt that shift, even if they could not fully explain it, because something had been introduced that did not fit with the professional identity they had spent years building. And when identity begins to weaken, awareness begins to grow, and awareness is rarely gentle, because awareness does not remove ambition. It removes the illusions people use to justify sacrificing themselves for it. And the people surrounding him felt that pressure begin to build, not outwardly, but inwardly, because now the question was no longer about hard work. It was about why exhaustion has become proof of value in the first place. And personal questions are always harder to escape than professional ones. And the young employee who had spoken earlier loosened his tie slowly, his posture no longer disciplined, his eyes no longer pretending to hide the fatigue beneath them. And after several silent moments, he looked toward Friedrich Nietzsche again, this time without corporate confidence, without rehearsed optimism, and asked why modern workplaces reward people most when they ignore their own limits. And the question carried something new, not ambition, not challenge, but vulnerability. And vulnerability is always more honest than certainty, because it appears when something real has finally been touched, and Nietzsche answered calmly, saying that systems built around productivity eventually begin consuming the people who depend on productivity for identity. And the words moved through the office differently this time, because they did not attack work. They exposed dependency. And exposure is far more difficult to resist than contradiction, because contradiction creates defense, but exposure creates reflection, and reflection is slower, heavier, and far more difficult to escape. And Nietzsche continued, saying that many people no longer work merely to survive. They work to justify themselves, to feel valuable, respected, necessary, visible, and one's self-worth becomes tied entirely to output. Rest begins to feel like guilt, silence begins to feel like failure, and exhaustion begins to feel normal. And the word settled into the office with quiet weight, because they did not describe burnout as weakness. They described it as adaptation. And adaptation is something people rarely question, because what everyone around you normalizes eventually becomes invisible, and what becomes invisible eventually feels unavoidable. And the employees felt that idea begin to move through them, not as agreement, but as tension. Because now overwork was no longer something temporary, no longer something associated only with ambition or success. It had become something far more personal, something internal, something that reached beyond the office itself. And one of the older managers standing near a glass meeting room slowly removed his glasses, the reflection of spreadsheets and emails fading from his tired eyes. And he asked whether modern people are sacrificing their lives for systems that would replace them in days if they disappeared. And the question hung beneath the fluorescent lights longer than expected, because everyone listening recognized something personal within it. And Nietzsche looked toward him, not with sympathy, not with cruelty, but with clarity, and said that the most dangerous systems are the ones that convince people their exhaustion is meaningful while quietly making them disposable. And the words moved deeper than anything before them, because they removed the comforting illusion that loyalty guarantees value, that hard work guarantees recognition, that sacrifice guarantees fulfillment. And instead, they placed responsibility where most people least want it, within themselves. And the office fell quiet, not because anyone agreed, but because something within them had already begun to shift, something that could not be undone through denial alone. And Nietzsche, seeing that shift, did not push harder, did not raise his voice, because the office had already done enough. And instead, he said that the saddest employees are not the unsuccessful ones. They are the ones who slowly lose themselves while being praised for dedication. The keyboards did not stop clicking. The fluorescent lights still burned coldly above endless rows of desks and glowing monitors. The elevator still opened and closed as employees moved through glass corridors carrying deadlines, coffee cups, presentations, and carefully controlled stress. And yet, somehow, everything had already begun to feel different, and the words settled into the sleepless office with quiet finality, because what they were feeling was not stress. It was something far more unsettling, a quiet realization that the life consuming them every day may not actually care whether they survive it. And for the first time, the glowing office no longer felt ambitious. It felt hungry. The monitors still glowed across the office floor. The fluorescent lights still hummed above rows of desks covered in unfinished reports, empty coffee cups, and lives slowly compressed into calendars, deadlines, and performance reviews. The city outside still moved endlessly beneath the rain. And yet, somehow, none of it felt the same. Because something had shifted, not in the building, not in the endless rhythm of meetings, emails, presentations, and carefully managed exhaustion surrounding everyone there, but in the way work itself was now being understood. And that difference was enough to change everything. Because once a person begins to question the system consuming their life, the system itself no longer feels natural. And employees sitting beneath those cold fluorescent lights felt it, even if they could not fully explain it. Because something had been introduced that did not require agreement to exist, something that had already begun to alter the way they understood ambition, professionalism, loyalty, sacrifice, and the invisible trade each of them had, quietly made between achievement and identity long before they ever realized how much of themselves had already disappeared inside it. And that alteration is what makes an idea dangerous, not because it destroys discipline, but because it removes excuses. And Friedrich Nietzsche stood calmly within that silence, not as someone untouched by struggle, but as someone who had stopped measuring human worth through exhaustion. And that difference was impossible not to notice, because systems reward productivity. But life demands presence, and the young employee who had spoken first looked toward him again, his voice quieter now, stripped of ambition, stripped even of performance he had worn since entering the building years earlier, asking, "What happens to those who realize too late that they spent most of their lives becoming useful without ever becoming alive?" And the question carried something new, not fear, not challenge, but honesty. And honesty is always heavier than certainty, because it appears when performance finally ends. And Nietzsche answered calmly, saying that realizing you've been consumed is painful, but never noticing it is worse. The monitors still glowed across the office floor. The fluorescent lights still hummed above rows of desks covered in unfinished reports, empty coffee cups, and lives slowly compressed into calendars, deadlines, and performance reviews. The city outside still moved endlessly beneath the rain. And yet, somehow, none of it felt the same. And the words moved through the office with a kind of quiet force, because they did not attack work. They stripped modern success of innocence. And innocence is what most people hide behind when ambition becomes too personal. And Nietzsche continued, saying that many people believe they are building careers, while in reality they are slowly building identities dependent on approval, productivity, and external recognition, until eventually they no longer know who they are outside performance itself. And the employees felt that idea settle into them with quiet weight, because now work was no longer something separate from life, no longer something left behind at the end of the day, no longer something limited to salaries, promotions, or titles. It had become something internal, something shaping personality, relationships, sleep, self-worth, and even the ability to feel alive without being busy. And the office fell silent, not because anyone agreed, but because something within them had already begun to shift, something that could not be undone through denial alone. And Nietzsche walked slowly toward the massive glass windows overlooking the endless city lights, where thousands of other office towers still glowed against the night like machines refusing to sleep. And without turning back, he spoke one final time, saying that the greatest tragedy is not working hard. It is spending your entire life becoming valuable to a system while remaining a stranger to yourself. The monitors still glowed across the office floor. The fluorescent lights still hummed above rows of desks covered in unfinished reports, empty coffee cups, and lives slowly compressed into calendars, deadlines, and performance reviews. The city outside still moved endlessly beneath the rain. And yet, somehow, none of it felt the same, and the words settled deeper than anything before them, because they did not promise escape. They demanded awareness. And awareness is always heavier than distraction, because distraction asks you to continue. But awareness asks you to stop and ask whether the life consuming you is actually yours. And no one spoke after that, because there was nothing left to defend, nothing left to rationalize, nothing left to hide behind. And as Friedrich Nietzsche disappeared slowly into the cold reflections of glass walls, fluorescent light, and sleepless city shadows, the employees remained exactly where they were. And yet none of them felt the same. Because once a person realizes that a system may reward their usefulness while quietly destroying their spirit, they cannot fully return to the comfort of pretending not to know it.